Everyone was watching the ring. Everyone was watching Oba Femi standing in the center of the Night of Champions stage in Riyadh with the King of the Ring crown above his head, microphone in hand, pointing directly at Roman Reigns' championship and telling the world he was coming. Everyone was watching the bloodline close in. Everyone was watching that extraordinary standoff, one man alone, refusing to move, refusing to blink, refusing to give Roman Reigns the satisfaction of a single backward step. Nobody was watching Roman Reigns backstage. And that is precisely where the most interesting thing happened. Because while the cameras were pointed at the ring, while the crowd was roaring and the commentary team was doing what commentary teams do in moments like that, Roman Reigns was doing something behind the scenes that the majority of the WWE universe has completely missed. Something that, once you see it, raises questions that do not have comfortable answers. Questions about power and jealousy and the specific psychology of a man who has spent years at the very top of this company watching other people rise toward him and finding ways, always finding ways, to ensure they arrive on terms that suit him rather than terms that might actually threaten him. What Roman did backstage after Oba Femi was crowned King of the Ring is not dramatic. It is not a brawl or a confrontation or a piece of footage that plays as a highlight. It is quiet. It is subtle. It is the kind of move that only means something when you understand the context around it, and it should have everyone talking. Welcome back to Wrestling Stands. Let's get into the thing nobody else is discussing. Quick favor before we go any further, if you're enjoying this kind of content, please smash that like button and hit subscribe. Over 98% of viewers watch without ever subscribing. It's completely free for you, but it genuinely means the world to us and helps the channel grow. Already subscribed? You absolute legend, thank you so much. Right, let's get into it. First, let's establish the atmosphere backstage at Night of Champions in the immediate aftermath of the King of the Ring final, because the emotional and political temperature of that environment is the context in which everything Roman did needs to be understood. The bloodline came to Riyadh expecting Jey Uso to win that tournament. Roman had made that expectation explicit, the blessing, the demand, the strategic vision of Jey bringing the King of the Ring crown into the family and using the SummerSlam title shot to face Cody Rhodes. That was the plan. That was what Roman had positioned. That was the outcome the entire bloodline apparatus had been pointed toward. Oba Femi dismantled that plan. Not accidentally, not through luck, not through the kind of controversial finish that leaves room for the disappointed party to argue the result should have been different. He caught Jey Uso mid-air on the Uso splash and drove him through the canvas with the fall from grace, clean, emphatically, without ambiguity. The plan Roman had invested in was gone. The outcome Roman had decided was appropriate had been overridden by a man who has been consistently, visibly, comprehensively demonstrating that his trajectory is not something anyone, including Roman Reigns, has the ability to control. Jey Uso was recovering. The bloodline was recalibrating. And Oba Femi was in the ring demanding a title match immediately, in front of everyone, pointing at Roman's championship as though it already belonged to him. In that specific moment of bloodline disruption, when the plan had failed, when Oba Femi was occupying the exact center of attention that Roman Reigns is accustomed to occupying, what did Roman Reigns do backstage? He went quiet. Not the strategic silence we have discussed before in the context of Solo Siko's provocations. Not the deliberate, message-sending restraint that Roman uses when he wants someone to understand that the response is being prepared rather than absent. Something different. Something more internal. Something that the people in that backstage area, watching Roman Reigns process the reality of Oba Femi's crowning, described with a word that you do not often hear applied to Roman Reigns. He went still. Let's talk about what Roman Reigns being still means, because it is not his default state and it is not what you would expect from a man who is supposedly entirely comfortable with Oba Femi as the next challenger. Roman Reigns in control of a situation is never still. He is always operating, always communicating through body language or eye contact or deliberate positioning, always ensuring that the space around him is shaped by his presence rather than simply occupied by it. The stillness is a tell. Not of panic, not of weakness. Roman Reigns does not do panic or weakness, but of something being processed at a deeper level than the usual calculation. What was being processed was this: Oba Femi just stood in that ring, alone, surrounded by the bloodline, and asked for Roman's championship as though the question of whether he would get it was a matter of when rather than if. And the crowd, the same crowd that Roman Reigns has spent years learning how to read, erupted for him. Not politely, not with the measured appreciation of an audience acknowledging a talented performer, with the specific, unambiguous, full-throated noise of a crowd that has decided who they want to win the next championship match. They want Oba Femi to take the title. Roman heard that. In a building in Saudi Arabia, in front of an audience that has not always been the most vocally demonstrative in WWE's touring schedule, the response to Oba Femi's challenge was unmistakable. The crowd has picked their next champion, and their next champion is pointing at Roman Reigns. Roman's stillness backstage was the processing of that fact. Now here is where it gets interesting. Here is the piece that nobody is discussing. After the initial stillness, after whatever private processing Roman Reigns did in those first moments following the King of the Ring final, he moved. He did not go to the ring. He did not appear on camera. He did not make a statement through Paul Heyman or dispatch the bloodline to address the situation visibly. He went somewhere specific, and he had a specific conversation, and the nature of that conversation is what raises the questions that this video is built around. Roman Reigns sought out people connected to Oba Femi's world, not to threaten them. Not to send a message through them in the way Solo Psycho sends messages through Jimmy Uso, but to gather information, to understand, to ask, in the careful, oblique way that Roman Reigns asks things when he does not want the asking itself to be the story, what Femi's actual position was, what he wanted beyond the title, what his motivations were underneath the obvious surface-level ambition. Roman Reigns was conducting intelligence gathering on Oba Femi, on the night Femi was crowned King of the Ring. Before the dust had settled on the match, before the confetti had landed, before Roman had even fully formulated his public response to the challenge, he was already trying to understand his opponent at a level that goes beyond preparation for a match. That is not what a confident champion does when a new challenger emerges. A confident champion acknowledges the challenge, prepares for it appropriately, and trusts in his own capability to handle it when the moment arrives. Roman Reigns, the most dominant champion in WWE history, was asking questions about Oba Femi with a quiet urgency that suggested the challenge felt more significant than the confident public posture implies. Let's talk about jealousy, not as an insult, not as an accusation aimed at diminishing Roman Reigns or mischaracterizing who he is, but as a genuine psychological force that is entirely compatible with being the most powerful person in a given environment and simultaneously feeling threatened by what you see growing in your vicinity. Roman Reigns has been the most dominant force in WWE for an extended period. He has defined what the top of this company looks like, the booking, the long-term storytelling, the championship prestige. The Bloodline era has been, regardless of how individual fans feel about it, one of the most significant chapters in recent WWE history. Roman Reigns made that chapter. He owns it in a way that very few performers own eras. And now Oba Femi is arriving, not as a complement to what Roman built, not as someone who is going to help extend the Bloodline era or exist within it comfortably, as a replacement energy, as the thing that the crowd is starting to imagine where Roman Reigns currently stands, as the future arriving sooner than Roman might prefer it to. When Roman went still backstage after Oba Femi's crowning, and when he began quietly gathering intelligence on a man he has publicly appeared entirely prepared to face, what we are watching, underneath the confidence and the control and the tribal chief presentation, might be something more human than any of that. The recognition that someone has arrived who the crowd is ready for in a way that is beyond Roman's ability to manage. The awareness that the era he built has a specific, named successor standing in the ring in Riyadh demanding the transfer of power. Roman Reigns does not do jealousy the way most people do jealousy, loudly, visibly, without strategic overlay. Roman does jealousy the way he does everything else, quietly, calculated, with a plan forming underneath the emotion even as the emotion is doing its work. He goes still, he gathers information, he prepares, but the preparation that follows jealousy is different from the preparation that follows simple competitive assessment. It is more personal, more motivated, more likely to produce something disproportionate to what the situation technically requires, because the threat is not just to the title, not just to the plan, but to the identity. Roman Reigns' identity is built around being the most important, most dominant, most talked about figure at the top of WWE. Oba Femi, by the end of Night of Champions, was giving him very serious competition for at least one of those three things. There is another dimension to what Roman did backstage that connects to the specific move he eventually made visibly, the spear through the crowd, the attack on Femi as he stood in the ring demanding the title. Because understanding why Roman chose to respond the way he did requires understanding what he concluded from the quiet information gathering that preceded it. Roman learned something from those conversations. Not about Femi's weaknesses exactly, Femi has demonstrated pressures few of those in recent months, but about how Femi processes situations, about the specific nature of his confidence and whether it is the unshakable kind or the kind that has edges that can be found and applied against. What Roman found, we can infer this from the choice he made in how to respond publicly, is that Oba Femi's confidence is built on the expectation of direct confrontation. Femi prepares for the thing he can see coming. He stands in the ring and does not flinch when the bloodline closes in because he has prepared for the bloodline closing in. He told Roman Reigns to his face that he was coming because direct confrontation is where Femi operates most comfortably, where his physical gifts and his mental composure combine to make him genuinely formidable. Roman therefore decided not to give Femi direct confrontation, not the kind Femi was prepared for. The spear from the crowd, from behind, from an unexpected angle, at a moment of Femi's apparent triumph, was not just a physical attack. It was the result of a man who had gathered information about his opponent and concluded that the best way to find a crack was to approach from the direction that Femi was least ready for. The backstage intelligence gathering led directly to the crowd entrance. The stillness produced the spear. The jealousy, converted through Roman's extraordinary capacity for controlled action, became strategy. What does all of this mean going forward? What does it tell us about the SummerSlam chapter of this story that is now beginning to take shape? It tells us that Roman Reigns is taking Oba Femi more seriously than the public presentation of confident championship authority suggests. It tells us that the quiet moments, the stillness, the information gathering, the conversations that happened in corridors at Night of Champions while everyone was watching the ring, are going to be as important to this story as anything that happens on camera. Roman is not underestimating Oba Femi. The backstage activity after the King of the Ring crowning is proof of that. He is preparing in the specific, comprehensive way that Roman prepares when he knows the challenge is genuine. But here is the thing about comprehensive preparation: when it is motivated by something personal rather than purely competitive, it sometimes produces overreach. The most carefully planned responses to threats that feel existential have a tendency to be slightly too much, to go further than necessary, to reveal the level of concern that the champion would prefer to keep hidden. Roman's spear at Night of Champions, rather than a measured wait until SummerSlam, might itself be evidence of that. The plan not quite as patient as Roman usually manages, the response arriving slightly sooner than optimal because sitting with the threat any longer felt impossible. Roman Reigns is preparing. Roman Reigns is concerned. Roman Reigns is doing something backstage that nobody is discussing because everyone is watching the ring. The man who watches everything is now the one being watched. And the one watching him is the King of the Ring, with a contract in hand and a championship in his sights, who the crowd in Riyadh told Roman Reigns, loudly, clearly, unmistakably, they are ready to cheer. That is the situation Roman Reigns is managing. And the fact that he went still before he went into action tells you more about how significant it is than any promo he could cut about being confident. The most interesting moments in the Bloodline story have always been the ones the cameras almost missed. This is one of those moments. Cheers for watching, it genuinely means everything. We'll see you in the next one.